Commander Kale Vashti had spent most of his career in space, exploring uncharted regions of the galaxy, investigating strange phenomena, and maintaining peace across the Elfar territories. His latest mission had brought him to a quiet, forgotten corner of the galaxy, a barren planet far from civilization. He had received a peculiar signal, a distress call faint but unmistakably human. It wasn't something he had expected. Earth, humanity's homeworld, had been isolated from the galactic community for centuries, cut off by their own leaders during the war. The last human colony had vanished without a trace. Yet here he was, tracking a signal, an impossible message. Kale landed his starship, the Elysium, in a vast, desolate valley. There was no sign of life, just endless dust storms and jagged cliffs. He felt the weight of isolation pressing against him, but he couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity that led him to this forsaken place. The signal had to be real. He was certain of it. As he stepped out of the ship, his boots crunching the dry earth, Kale felt the sharp contrast between the stillness of the world around him and the pulse of the signal guiding him. He activated his scanners and tracked the signal sourced to a ruined structure in the distance. It looked ancient, long abandoned, and yet there was something about it that made Kale uneasy. Was someone still here? The ruins were old, the architecture unlike anything Kale had ever seen, and yet the signal emanated from within. With cautious steps, he made his way toward the structure. His instincts told him to be careful, to proceed with suspicion, but a strange force urged him forward. As he entered the decaying building, the air felt charged with energy, and the faint hum of machinery echoed through the walls. He glanced around and found nothing that resembled a control room, only more rubble. That's when he saw her. Standing in the middle of the room, amidst the wreckage, was a woman. She was tall and striking, with sharp, ethereal features that immediately set her apart from anything Kale had ever seen before. Her eyes, glowing faintly, looked at him with an intensity that froze him in his tracks. She wasn't human. There was no mistaking that. Her skin shimmered with a strange hue, and her silver hair flowed as if caught in an invisible wind. But it was her gaze that caught him most of all. It was a look of recognition, as if she had been waiting for him. You're human," she said, her voice soft yet full of authority. Her words seemed familiar, yet Kale couldn't place them. He stepped forward, unsure whether he was seeing a vision or encountering something far more extraordinary. "Who are you?" Kale asked, his voice steady despite the growing sense of confusion and unease. "And how do you know I'm human?" The woman's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Kale thought he saw something like sadness in her expression. "I gave up everything to see you again, human," she said softly, as if the words weighed heavy on her heart. Her words sent a chill down Kale's spine. He had no idea who she was, nor how she knew him, but there was a connection between them that was undeniable, a connection that felt older than time itself. "I don't understand," Kale admitted, his voice tinged with a mix of frustration and curiosity. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The woman seemed to consider his words carefully before she spoke again. "I am Elira," she said, her voice a mixture of determination and something deeper, something personal. "I was once part of an ancient alliance. I remember you. We fought together in a war that spanned the galaxy. But the details, they were erased. I was forced to forget you." Kale's mind raced. He had heard whispers of ancient wars between powerful species, conflicts that had shaped the galaxy, but he had never been told about any alliances with other worlds. As far as he knew, Earth had cut itself off from the rest of the galaxy centuries ago. There were no records of humanity's involvement in any intergalactic conflict. "Forget me," Kale echoed. "What do you mean? I've never met you before. I've never." Elira's eyes softened as she stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You don't remember, do you? The war, the bond we shared. Everything has been lost. But I spent years trying to find you again. And now that I have," She paused, her voice trembling. It's time for the truth to come out. The air between them thickened, heavy with unspoken histories and emotions that neither of them fully understood. I don't understand any of this, Cale whispered, his mind racing. Why didn't you tell me this before? Elira took a deep breath, her silver hair shimmering in the dim light. I couldn't. You weren't ready to remember. As Cale stood in the ruins, staring into Elira's glowing eyes, he realized this moment would change everything. Cale sat across from Elira in the dimly lit control room of his ship, the Elysium. The planet's surface still visible through the large viewport, its barren landscape stretched endlessly beneath a sky filled with swirling clouds. The air in the room was heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Cale tried to make sense of it all. How had a woman like Elira appeared from nowhere, claiming to know him, speaking of a past life he couldn't even remember? The more he looked at her, the more confused he became. Her words echoed in his mind. I gave up everything to see you again, human. Elira, Cale began, his voice quiet but urgent. I don't understand. I don't remember any of this. What is this war you're talking about? And why is everything so hazy? The galaxy, Earth, it's been isolated for so long. How can I possibly have fought in this war with you? Elira's eyes softened as she studied him. There was a quiet sadness in her gaze, but also something stronger, a determination that Cale hadn't seen in many others. She had endured more than anyone could imagine, and her conviction was as unwavering as ever. It's not just you, Cale, she said, her voice filled with emotion. You're not the only one with forgotten memories. Everyone who fought in that war had their minds wiped. Humans, Elfar, and others. It was a matter of survival. We couldn't risk the knowledge of our shared past spreading across the galaxy. The war was devastating, and its scars run deep. Those who were involved couldn't be trusted with that power. The alliances we formed, the enemies we made, it was all erased. Cale's mind raced. He had heard of galactic wars in the history books, of course, but this was something else. Something real. You're saying we fought in this war together, and I just don't remember. Elira nodded slowly. Yes, we were part of a coalition. The war was unlike anything you've read in human history. The Tizar Empire wanted to expand, to claim more of the galaxy, but it wasn't just them. There were others, factions, entire civilizations, who believed in conquering and ruling, while we fought to maintain peace. But we lost. It wasn't just a military loss. It was a loss of everything we had built. Her voice caught for a moment, as if the weight of the past still crushed her. And you were a key player in that. You were the one who helped me bring the fight to the Tizar. Together, we were unstoppable. Cale shook his head, disbelief flooding his mind. The story she told was so grand, so impossible, that it felt like something out of an old, forgotten legend. Yet the way she spoke, the pain in her eyes, made it impossible for him to dismiss her words. He didn't know what to believe, but there was something about her, something that tugged at his very soul. You were with me, through it all? Cale asked, his voice quieter now. Elira didn't immediately answer. She looked down, as if searching for the right words, and when she spoke again, it was with a heaviness that seemed to fill the room. Yes, she said softly. We were comrades. We shared more than just battle plans. We shared hopes, dreams, fears. There was a bond between us, Cale. A deep, unspoken connection. But in the end, our victory came at a cost. When it became clear that the war was tearing everything apart, the higher-ups decided we needed to forget. They wiped our memories, forced us to move on, for the good of the galaxy. Cale felt a pang of frustration. But why? Why did they do that to us? How could they just take everything? Our lives, our victories, and our love, and erase it? Elira's eyes flickered with sorrow. Because we were dangerous, Cale. We had the power to start a new war if we remembered. They couldn't risk the two of us ever coming together again. They feared what we could do if we found each other, if we remembered our bond. She paused, then added with a heavy sigh, I gave up everything to protect you, to protect the peace we built. But they didn't want us to succeed. They wanted us to forget the war, forget each other. Cal's mind was a whirlwind. He didn't know how to process everything. The past she described felt too distant, too unreal. And yet, the connection he felt to her was undeniable. It was like an invisible thread that linked them, even if his memories were lost to time. She had been there, beside him, in the darkest moments of the war. And now she was back. She had found him. The question now was, why? I don't know if I can remember it all, Cal said, shaking his head slowly. But one thing is clear, you came all this way to find me. You said we still have a chance to make things right. But if our memories were wiped, if we were forgotten by the galaxy, what does that mean for us now? Elira stood up, her face determined. It means that we fight for the future, together. We may have lost the past, Hale, but we still have the present, and we're not done yet. The galaxy is still at war. Cal sat silently in the captain's chair of the Elysium, staring at the blinking stars through the viewport. His mind was still reeling from everything Elira had revealed. A forgotten war. A bond lost to time. Memories wiped clean. The past seemed like a distant, impossible dream. And yet, with every passing moment, he felt more certain that what she had told him was real. He could almost hear the echoes of her voice in his mind. We fought together, Cal. We were unstoppable. It was an overwhelming feeling, one that pushed him to question everything he knew about himself and his past. Elira had been in her quarters, preparing the ship's systems for their journey. Cal had needed time to process the information. But the more he thought about it, the more questions piled up. Why had the war been so dangerous? And who had erased their memories, and why? He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was far more complicated than Elira had let on. His thoughts were interrupted by the soft beep of a warning signal. A distress call. Cal quickly activated the ship's communication system, watching the screen as a coded message appeared. It was a simple message, but one that immediately sent a chill down his spine. It was from a source he couldn't identify. But the words were clear. The Tizar Empire has returned. They are hunting you. The Tizar Empire. The very same empire that Elira had spoken about in the war. Cal's heart skipped a beat. He had to admit, the mention of their names sent a rush of memories he couldn't quite grasp. Images of battles, of deadly enemies, and of Elira's determined face beside him. He had always known the Tizar were ruthless, but hearing they had returned made everything feel more urgent, more real. Cal immediately contacted Elira. The call went through, and her face appeared on the screen, calm and collected, but there was a certain tension in her eyes. She could sense the seriousness of the moment. "Did you see the message?" Cal asked, his voice tight with concern. Elira nodded, her expression hardening. "I did. They're back. I knew it wouldn't be long before they came for us." Cal felt a surge of unease. But how? I thought they were defeated, driven back during the war. What could they want now? Elira's eyes flashed with determination. The Tizar never truly left. They'd been building strength in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. They never forgave us for what we did to them. And now that we're here, together, they know we have the power to defeat them once again. But they won't let that happen. They will stop at nothing to erase us for good. Cal clenched his fists. The weight of their situation was beginning to settle in. He had no memories of the war, no memories of his past, but he knew one thing for certain now. The Tizar Empire was not just a part of history. They were a threat to the galaxy, and to him and Elira. "We need to act fast," Cal said. "If they know where we are, we can't afford to wait any longer. We need to find out who else is out there, and we need to be ready for whatever comes next." Elira looked at him with a mixture of pride and sadness. "You're right. We can't let them take us down again. We'll gather what allies we can. There's still hope, Kale, but we'll need to move quickly. As the two of them began to plan their next move, Kale couldn't help but think of all the questions still unanswered. Why had the Tizar returned now? What did they want with him and Illyra? And most importantly, how could they stop a force that had already brought the galaxy to its knees once before? The Elysium hummed softly beneath them as they set a course for a nearby star system, a place where they might find some answers. But Kale knew that no matter what they found, the war was far from over. They were about to step back into a battle that would shape the future of the galaxy once again. And this time, they couldn't afford to fail. The Elysium cut through the stars at full speed, its sleek hull reflecting the faint light of distant suns. Kale stood at the helm, his hands gripping the control panel as he guided the ship toward their destination. Illyra stood nearby, her face set in a determined expression as she studied the data streaming across the display. The distress call from the Tizar had been just the beginning. There was no denying it now. The Empire's return was a threat they couldn't ignore. As they approached the star system they'd set their course for, Kale felt the weight of the decisions ahead pressing down on him. He had no memories of the war, no memories of the battles that had shaped the galaxy. But one thing was becoming clearer with each passing moment. The past was not something they could escape. The Tizar Empire had not only returned, they were hunting him and Illyra, and they wouldn't stop until they were both wiped out. "We're almost there," Kale said, his voice steady, but the tension was evident in his tone. Illyra glanced over at him, her eyes serious. "We'll need to be ready. We don't know how many ships the Tizar have, or what kind of weapons they've developed since the war ended. But if they're targeting us, we can't afford to wait. We need allies, and we need them now." Kale nodded. He knew that much was true. The galaxy was vast, and while there were still factions that could help them, the question was whether they could trust them. Could they rely on old alliances, or would they be forced to make new ones? He didn't know, but they didn't have time to waste. The Tizar were closing in. The ship dropped out of hyperspace, and the first thing Kale noticed was the planet below. It was a lush green world, its surface dotted with large oceans and sprawling cities. This was the homeworld of the Valinari, a race known for their technological prowess and strong sense of honor. During the war, they had been one of the few allies the humans and Elfar had managed to count on. But that had been years ago. Would they still stand with them now? "Contacting Valinari leaders now," Illyra said, her voice calm but firm. "We'll see if they remember the old alliance." Kale watched as she worked, her fingers flying over the control panel. The Valinari were a proud people, and it was impossible to know what kind of relationship they had with the Tizar now. If the Tizar had rebuilt their empire, the Valinari might have already chosen a side. But that didn't matter right now. They had to try. It was their only option. As the communication line opened, Kale felt a brief moment of hope. The screen flickered to life, and a familiar face appeared. It was Commander Talon, one of the highest-ranking officers among the Valinari, a figure Kale had worked alongside during the war. Talon's sharp eyes looked back at them, his expression unreadable. "Commander Kale," Talon said, his voice low but strong. "I never expected to hear from you again. I see you've come to us at a time of great peril." Kale leaned forward, urgency in his voice. "The Tizar Empire is back, Talon. They're hunting us, and they won't stop until we're destroyed. We need your help." Talon's eyes darkened. "We've heard rumors of the Tizar's return, but we didn't know how soon it would be. You've come at the right time, Kale, but there are forces in the galaxy who would rather see the Tizar return to power. Many factions fear them, and some have already pledged their allegiance." Kale's heart sank. He had expected resistance, but not this. "Are you telling me you've made a deal with them?" Talon shook his head. "No, not yet, but the political landscape is shifting. I can't speak for the entire Valinari people, but I will offer you what I can. I have a fleet nearby that can be ready in a few days, but you need to act fast. If you wait too long, the Tizar may strike first. Kel's pulse quickened. Then we'll move quickly. Thank you, Talon. We'll be ready. The connection cut off, and Kel turned to Illyra, his face grim. The Valinari are willing to help, but we're running out of time. We need to find other allies, and we need to do it now. Illyra nodded, her expression as focused as ever. We'll find them, Kel. We can't fail. The galaxy needs us. With the Valinari fleet on their side, Kel felt a glimmer of hope. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The Tizar Empire had been lurking in the shadows for too long, and now they were ready to strike. If they didn't act soon, everything they had fought for, the peace they had struggled to build, would be lost. The stars outside the ship flickered, and Kel felt the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders. He didn't know what the future held, but he did know one thing. He wasn't going to let the Tizar destroy everything they had fought for. Not again. The Elysium drifted silently through the depths of space, its sleek, silver hull glinting in the dim light of distant stars. Inside the ship, the mood was heavy. Kel paced restlessly in the command room, his mind racing. The Valinari had agreed to aid them, but their support was still uncertain. Time was running out, and the Tizar were drawing closer. Every passing second felt like a countdown to something they couldn't yet fully understand. Illyra stood at the large viewport, her eyes fixed on the swirling galaxy ahead. She had always been the calm one, the steady hand in their turbulent partnership, but even she couldn't ignore the weight of what lay ahead. Kel had seen the flicker of doubt in her eyes earlier. She knew that the galaxy was on the brink of war once again, and their fight was far from over. "We're running out of time," Kel said, breaking the silence. He stopped in front of Illyra, his gaze serious. "The Tizar will be here soon. We need more than just the Valinari fleet if we're going to stop them. We need more allies, and we need them fast." Illyra turned toward him, her face set in determination. "I know, but we can't force alliances. If we try to rush things, we might push people away. We need to build trust, Kel. The galaxy isn't the same as it was during the war." Kel clenched his fists, frustration evident in his posture. "You think I don't know that? But we don't have time to wait for trust. The Tizar won't give us that luxury." Illyra took a deep breath, her calmness returning. "We have one more option. It's risky, but it might just give us the upper hand." Kel raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. "What are you suggesting?" "We could reach out to the Elfar. They were our most powerful ally during the war. They have vast resources, and their fleets were unmatched. But they've been isolated for years now. They retreated after the war ended, and no one has heard from them since." Kel's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the Elfar. He had heard stories of their strength, their intelligence, and their ability to manipulate the very fabric of space itself. If they could bring the Elfar into the fight, they would have a chance at defeating the Tizar. But it was a gamble. The Elfar were enigmatic, and they had their own reasons for withdrawing from galactic affairs. They wouldn't just join the fight without a good reason. "How do we even reach them?" Kel asked, his voice low. "There's a way," Illyra replied. "A hidden colony, far off the beaten path. Only a few know about it. If we can get there, we might be able to convince them to join us." Kel hesitated, weighing the risks. "It's a long shot, Illyra. And if we fail?" "If we fail," Illyra interrupted, "we risk everything. The Tizar will destroy us, Kel. But if we succeed, we have a chance to stop them once and for all." Kel turned to face the stars, his mind racing. The Elfar were their last hope, the galaxy's last hope. But to find them, they would have to travel through dangerous, uncharted space, territory where few ships dared to venture. The risk was immense, but the alternative was even worse. "I'm in," Kel said finally, his voice steady. "Let's do it." With a determined nod, Illyra moved to the navigation controls. She set a course for the hidden Elfar colony, her fingers moving with practiced precision. The ship's engines hummed to life, and the stars outside the viewport began to blur as the Elysium jumped into hyperspace. As the ship shot through the galaxy, Cal's mind turned inward. He thought about the war, about the memories he didn't have. How had he and Illyra fought side by side? What had they lost during that time? He could still feel the echoes of their bond, faint but undeniable, pulling him toward something he couldn't quite understand. The journey ahead was dangerous, and they didn't know what would await them on the other side. But Cal knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to let the Tizar take everything he and Illyra had fought for. The galaxy had been through enough destruction. It was time for a new chapter, and if the Elfar could help them write it, then they had to try. Illyra looked over at him, her gaze full of quiet resolve. "We'll get through this, Cal. Together." Cal gave her a small nod, his confidence returning. Together. The path ahead was uncertain, but they weren't alone. And that, for the first time in what felt like forever, gave Cal a sense of hope. They were about to face their greatest challenge yet, but with Illyra at his side. And the Elfar, if they were willing to help, they just might have a chance. The Elysium surged forward through the depths of uncharted space, its engines humming steadily, but there was an unsettling quiet that had settled over the ship. Cal stood at the control panel, watching the swirling colors of hyperspace as they passed by. The feeling of uncertainty pressed in on him with each passing moment. The path they were on was unknown, their destination a place that even the most seasoned navigators dared not chart. He had no idea what to expect, but one thing was clear. If they didn't find the Elfar, their fight against the Tizar would be over before it had even truly begun. Illyra, seated at the command station, was unusually quiet. Cal had noticed that her usually calm demeanor was replaced by a shadow of doubt. She was always the one who kept him grounded, who guided him with her unshakable faith. But now, even she seemed unsure of what awaited them on this dangerous journey. "Are you sure this is the right course?" Cal asked, his voice breaking the silence. He glanced over at Illyra, his brow furrowed. Illyra didn't look up from the console, but nodded, her fingers moving gracefully across the controls. "There's no other option, Cal. The Elfar are our last hope. If we don't make contact with them soon, we'll be facing the Tizar alone. This path may be hidden, but it's our best shot." Cal stood beside her, looking at the map of stars that glowed faintly on the screen. "It just feels too easy. I mean, why would the Elfar just be waiting for us? If they've been hiding for so long, why would they risk getting involved now?" Illyra finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mix of determination and caution. "The Elfar have their reasons for staying out of the galaxy's affairs. They don't trust easily. They won't fight unless they have no other choice. But right now, their choice is clear. The Tizar are a threat to everyone. Even the Elfar can't ignore that." Cal was still uncertain. "But if the Tizar were able to rise again, what makes you think the Elfar haven't changed? Maybe they've found their own way to gain power. Maybe they've aligned themselves with the enemy." Illyra shook her head. "I don't believe that. The Elfar value knowledge more than anything. They're not easily swayed by power. But they've been isolated for so long that no one really knows what's going on in their territory. We can't afford to assume the worst." Cal sighed, his mind racing. He wanted to trust Illyra. He always had. But the feeling of dread wouldn't leave him. The Elfar had been allies during the war, yes, but so much had changed since then. Could they still count on them after so many years of silence? And if they could, would it be enough to defeat the Tizar? The ship's alert system suddenly beeped, cutting through the tension. Illyra's hands moved quickly to the controls, and Cal leaned forward, his heart pounding. "Something's wrong," Illyra muttered. Her eyes scanned the screen rapidly. "We're being pulled out of hyperspace." Cal's stomach tightened, The Elysium lurched as it came out of hyperspace, and they found themselves drifting into an unknown system. The stars were different here, darker, more distant. Kel could feel the weight of the unknown pressing in on them, and his instincts screamed that they had wandered into dangerous territory. "Where are we?" Cale asked, trying to hide the concern in his voice. Elira's eyes narrowed as she studied the star system on the screen. "I don't know. This doesn't match any known star charts. We've been pulled into some kind of gravitational anomaly." Before Cale could respond, a deep, rumbling voice echoed through the ship's communication system, making his blood run cold. "You've come seeking the Alphar," the voice said, "but you are not welcome here." Cale's heart skipped a beat. The voice was chillingly calm, but there was an undeniable authority to it. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. Elira's expression hardened, her hand hovering over the control panel. "We're not here to harm you," she said, her voice firm. "We need your help. The Tizar Empire is returning, and we can't face them alone." There was a long silence on the other end. Then the voice spoke again, its tone colder than before. "You come with the scent of desperation. The Alphar do not intervene lightly. But perhaps you are right. The Tizar must be stopped. Come closer, but be warned. This path will not be without its cost." Cale exchanged a glance with Elira, both of them realizing that they had entered a place where nothing would be simple. The Alphar were watching them, judging them, and whatever came next would shape their fate. They had made it this far, but the true test had only just begun. The Elysium hovered in the dim, strange space, the ship's engines barely making a sound. Outside, the stars were distant and cold, the unfamiliar gravity well pulling them into an orbit that felt too controlled. Cale stood beside the cockpit window, his eyes tracing the outline of the ship's trajectory as it drew closer to the source of the mysterious voice. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, but what choice did they have? They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Elira sat at the control panel, her fingers moving over the holographic interface with focused precision. She had been quiet ever since the voice had spoken to them, the weight of its words pressing heavily on her. She was always the calm one, but now even she seemed uncertain. Kel could tell that she was holding something back, a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. "What do you think?" Cale asked, his voice low. Elira's gaze remained fixed on the screen, but there was a flicker in her eyes. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke. "I don't know, Cale. This isn't what I expected. I thought the Alphar would be hidden, but not like this. There's something about the way they've isolated themselves that feels deliberate." Cale frowned, his hand resting on the back of her chair. "Do you think we're walking into a trap?" She finally turned to look at him, her face unreadable. "I think we're being tested. The Alphar don't trust easily, and they never act without reason. If they've agreed to let us come this far, it's because they're trying to determine whether we're worth the risk. We'll have to prove ourselves." Cale ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "We don't have time to play their games, Elira. The Tizar are getting closer every day. If the Alphar are the only ones who can help us, we need them now." Elira's expression softened, but her voice remained firm. "I know, but we can't force them, Cale. If we try to rush this, we risk making things worse. Trust me, I've seen it happen before." Cale sighed, his frustration building. "I don't have time for trust. I just want to stop the Tizar before they burn everything we fought for." "I know you do," Elira said gently. "But sometimes the hardest part isn't fighting the enemy. It's fighting the fear inside us." Before Cale could respond, the ship's systems beeped, signaling their arrival at the designated coordinates. A massive structure loomed ahead, hidden deep in the gravity well, its silhouette cutting through the darkness like a dark mountain. It was unlike anything Cale had ever seen, a vast, sprawling complex, its surface shimmering with a strange energy that seemed to ripple in the darkness. "Is that it?" Cale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elira nodded, her expression unreadable. That's the Elfar's home, or at least, what's left of it. The ship moved closer, guided by an unseen force, and Kel could feel the tension building in his chest. There was something ancient and powerful about the place. The Elfar had been living in isolation for centuries, and now, it seemed they were finally ready to reveal themselves, on their terms. As they neared the structure, the voice from earlier spoke again, its tone low and commanding. You have come seeking our aid, but know this, nothing comes without a price. You will face trials, tests of character, strength, and will. Only then will we decide if you are worthy of our help. Fail, and you will be left to face the Tuzar alone. Kel's heart pounded in his chest. He had known this would be difficult, but hearing the voice's words made the weight of their mission feel even heavier. They were not just asking for help. They were being judged. What kind of trials? Kel asked, his voice tense. The voice didn't respond immediately. Then it spoke once more, its words cutting through the silence like a blade. You will face the darkness within yourselves. You will confront your deepest fears, your greatest regrets, and only when you can overcome them will you be deemed worthy. Elira's grip tightened on the controls, but her voice was steady. We're ready, she said, her gaze meeting Kel's. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Kel nodded, swallowing his fear. He didn't know what awaited them on the other side, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't do this alone. And with Elira by his side, there was a chance, no matter how slim, that they could survive whatever the Elfar had in store for them. The Elysium docked with the structure, and the doors to the ship slid open. A cold wind swept over them as they stepped out onto the dark alien surface. The trials had begun. The air was thick with tension as Kel and Elira stepped onto the cold alien ground. The dark expanse stretched before them, the structure looming behind them like a silent sentinel. A faint hum of energy resonated through the air, vibrating beneath their feet. This was no ordinary place. It felt ancient, like it had witnessed millennia of history and secrets. The silence was almost oppressive, the weight of the unknown pressing in from all sides. As soon as they stepped forward, the ground beneath them shifted. It was subtle at first, a ripple in the earth, but then the ground began to crack open, revealing a swirling vortex of light. Kel instinctively stepped back, but Elira remained still, her gaze fixed on the glowing rift. This is it, she whispered, her voice steady despite the uncertainty in her eyes. The trial has begun. Kel's heart hammered in his chest. The voice of the Elfar had warned them this would not be easy, but now, standing before this rift, he could feel the weight of their words. Whatever lay beyond this portal would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. Without warning, the vortex expanded, pulling them both forward. Kel stumbled but regained his balance, gripping Elira's arm as they were sucked into the swirling light. The world around them distorted, twisting and warping as though they were being pulled apart and reassembled. When the world around them finally stopped spinning, they found themselves standing in a vast, empty space. The sky above them was dark, but there were no stars. Instead, strange symbols flickered in the air, glowing with an eerie light. The ground beneath them was a dark, smooth surface, stretching endlessly in all directions. A voice echoed from all directions, booming yet calm. Welcome, Kel and Elira. The trial begins now. To prove your worth, you must face what lies within you. Only by confronting your greatest fears can you hope to succeed. Kel's stomach twisted. He knew this was coming, but the reality of it was far more terrifying. He turned to Elira, but her face was unreadable, her eyes fixed on the strange symbols around them. She didn't seem afraid, but Kel couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. He could feel the presence of something far more ancient and powerful than they could comprehend. A figure appeared before them, materializing out of thin air. It was a tall, shadowy figure, its features obscured by darkness. Kel, the figure said, its voice cold and distant. You have long struggled with the weight of your past. You abandoned your home, your people. You failed to protect those you loved. Now you must face the consequences of your choices. Cal's breath caught in his throat. The figure's words struck a deep chord within him, stirring painful memories he had buried for so long. The faces of those he had lost, their screams, their fear, came rushing back in a flood of anguish. The guilt weighed heavily on him, threatening to drown him. Elira's voice cut through the haze of his thoughts. Cal, don't listen to it. This is just an illusion, a test. You can overcome it. The figure's shadowy form flickered, then turned toward Elira. And you, Elira, you believe you are strong, that your purpose is clear, but you too are hiding from the truth. You've convinced yourself that you can save everyone, that you must always be the protector. But what happens when you fail? What happens when you can't save those you love? Elira's expression faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. Cal could see the conflict in her eyes. She, too, was being tested, her deepest insecurities laid bare. They were both being forced to confront the parts of themselves they had hidden away for so long. The figure's voice echoed again, its tone more insistent. You cannot escape. These are your fears. Face them, or you will fail. Cal felt the darkness pressing in on him, the weight of his guilt, his regret, his fear that he was unworthy of their mission. But he couldn't let it control him. He had made mistakes, yes, but he could still fight. He could still make things right. Taking a deep breath, Cal stepped forward, pushing past the shadows of his past. I won't be consumed by this, he said, his voice firm. I've made mistakes, but I'm not a failure, and I will fight to protect the future. The figure's form flickered again, its expression unreadable. Very well, Cal. You have passed the first test. Elira stepped forward as well, her resolve clear in her eyes. I've failed before, but I will never stop fighting. I will protect those who need me. The figure nodded, its dark presence starting to fade. You have both shown strength, but this is only the beginning. The path ahead will be harder, and the tests will become more demanding. Only together can you overcome what is to come. As the figure disappeared into the darkness, Cal and Elira stood side by side, their hearts heavy but there. The trials had tested them in ways they never imagined, but nothing could have prepared Cal and Elira for what awaited them now. The air around them had shifted, becoming heavier, thicker, like the very atmosphere was pressing in on them. The sky, once dark and filled with strange symbols, had turned blood red, casting an eerie glow on the alien landscape around them. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very earth itself was alive. Cal's pulse quickened as he looked around, his senses heightened. They had passed the first trial, confronting their inner fears and regrets, but they both knew that this next challenge would be unlike anything they had faced before. The Alfar had warned them. Only those worthy could continue, but what would that truly mean? A low, rumbling sound echoed from all directions, and before they could react, the ground split open beneath them. Both Cal and Elira were thrown forward as a massive structure began to rise from the earth, an enormous spiked tower that reached far into the red sky. The air around them grew colder, and a chilling voice boomed through the silence. Cal, Elira, this is the final test. You will face the ultimate trial now. Not of your body, but of your heart. To succeed, you must prove your loyalty to each other. Only one of you may claim the prize that awaits at the top. Will you choose to fight against each other, or will you show the strength of your bond? The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Cal's heart raced as he looked at Elira. She, too, was staring at the tower, her face hard and unreadable. The tension between them was palpable. How could they make this choice? Would they fight for the power the Alfar had promised them, or would they honor the bond they had forged during their long journey together? Elira stepped forward first, her gaze unwavering as she met Cal's eyes. We came here together, she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "We fought side by side through everything. I don't want to lose you. We're in this together, no matter what happens." Cale swallowed hard, the weight of her words pressing on him. He had come to trust her completely, but the idea of sacrificing everything they had fought for was nearly unbearable. The tower loomed ahead, its sharp edges reflecting the red light of the sky. The challenge before them was clear. Only one of them could emerge victorious. But Cale couldn't bring himself to turn against her. They had seen too much, fought too hard, to let anything tear them apart now. "I won't fight you, Elira," he said, his voice fierce. "I won't do it. If we have to face this trial, we do it together." Elira's eyes softened, and she nodded. There was a flicker of understanding between them, a silent agreement that whatever the Elthar's challenge was, they would face it as one. They took a step forward together, the red glow of the tower casting an ominous light on their path. As they moved closer to the towering structure, the ground beneath them began to rumble, and a set of massive stone doors slowly creaked open, revealing the final chamber. Inside, the air was thick with the same energy that had surrounded them from the beginning. Alive, electric, like the very heart of the Elthar's ancient power. The voice echoed again, this time colder, almost disappointed. "You have chosen your path. But know this, there is no such thing as an easy victory. Only those who are truly worthy can survive the final test. Will you endure the trials of the heart, or will you fail?" The doors slammed shut behind them, and they were left alone in the chamber. As they moved forward, the walls seemed to pulse with light, and a figure appeared in front of them, an ethereal being, translucent and glowing, with an aura of pure energy. The figure raised its hand, and a series of symbols flickered in the air, surrounding them on all sides. "This is the final choice," the figure intoned. "What is your true desire? Power or sacrifice? Only by choosing the right path will you earn the Elthar's gift." Cale felt the weight of the question pressing on him. His mind raced as he considered what the right answer could be. He had come this far, risking everything to save his people, to defeat the Tuzar. But at what cost? Elira's voice broke through his thoughts. "It's not about power, Cale," she said quietly. "It's about what we're willing to sacrifice for the greater good. We don't need power to win. We need each other." The figure in front of them smiled, its face radiating a warm, golden light. "You have chosen wisely, Cale and Elira. The strength of your bond is the true power. You have passed the final test." As the figure vanished, the chamber around them began to dissolve, the air lightening, the oppressive energy lifting. Cale and Elira stood side by side, their hearts still racing, but now with a new sense of peace. They had done it, together.